When discussing failed airlines in Asia, one country with its fair share of them is the Philippines, which for around 2 decades from the 1970s to the 1990s had one airline serving the country, national carrier Philippine Airlines. This would change in the mid-1990s when the skies over the Philippines were opened for competing airlines. Among these ambitious airlines looking to take on Philippine Airlines at the time was Grand Air, which some of the older Filipino viewers may remember as it operated out of Manila in the late 1990s. For this next part of the closed series, I'll take a look at the history of Grand Air and why it failed. These days, many Filipino travelers often take for granted the available options for travel within the Philippines and also internationally. However, it was never always that way. For much of the 1970s and 1980s, Philippine Airlines was the monopoly domestic carrier under, at the time, a one-airline policy for the country. This would soon change into the 1990s as the trend of deregulation was initiating discussions in the Philippines as to the future of the aviation industry. Into the 1990s, Philippine Airlines was a government-owned airline, which the Philippine government would eventually sell a 67% stake to PR Holdings, making the company private once again after several decades. Still, Philippine Airlines was a monopoly of the aviation industry in the Philippines, but that would soon change with Executive Order 219 on January 3, 1995. Signed by then-President Fidel Ramos, the executive order was titled Establishing the Domestic and International Civil Aviation Liberalization Policy, which opened up domestic routes for more competition, and this is where the story of Grand Air begins. Sensing the opportunity to form a new airline as an alternative to Philippine Airlines, the group was led by Rebecca Panlilio, who at the time was known as a hotel developer. Among the notable properties include the Grand Boulevard Hotel and the Philippine Village Hotel, which was located right next to the current location of the Philippine Airlines Terminal 2 at Manila Airport, and does play a vital role for the airline later on. Along with Panlilio, the group leadership also had former executives of Philippine Airlines, including Dante Santos, a former Philippine Airlines president. Now, the prospects of having to see the launch of a competing airline did not really initially sit well with Philippine Airlines. They filed a protest with the Civil Aviation Board, and the case actually made it to the Philippine Supreme Court, where the ruling was to Grand Air and the Civil Aviation Board's favor. Panlilio and the group's plan for the airline would be a premium upmarket airline, bringing an international flight experience for domestic travelers. To start, the airline at least 2 Airbus A300s and set up its own passenger terminal right next to the Philippine Village Hotel. The vision to see a competing airline against Philippine Airlines would come to fruition in March of 1995 when the first flights were launched to Davao and Cebu out of Manila. Later on, the airline would acquire Boeing 737-200s for more domestic flights, this time expanding its route network to cities such as Cagayan de Oro, Iloilo, Tacloban, and Puerto Princesa. Looking to expand beyond the borders of the Philippines, it secured the permit for as an overseas operator, paving the way for international flights the following year in 1996. Its first international route was from Manila to Hong Kong, followed by Seoul. Other regional cities were planned and eventually added, but one of the more noteworthy things about Grand Air during this time was its launch of operations also coincided with the Philippine government's efforts to boost travel to and from other alternate airports such as Clark, Cebu, and Subic. As part of this efforts, by 1997, the airline was operating flights from Manila to Subic and onwards to Hong Kong. For the most part, things were going very well for the first 2 years. The airline was operating domestically and internationally and became the second flag carrier of the Philippines. Travelers had another option along with others that were emerging such as Cebu Pacific and Air Philippines at the time. Meanwhile, while planning for its future, its peak for its fleet included 9 aircraft including 5 A300s and 4 737-200s. However, as fate would have it, things would take a turn for the worse as the Asian financial crisis would hit the region and affect Grand Air. While Philippine Airlines saw a shutdown of the airline due to labor disputes, Grand Air was not only seeing some growing pains, but its international network took a hit as a result of the Asian financial crisis, and eventually its expenses started to pile up. Common signs of an airline failing, including the delays for hours, cancellations without notice, didn't help the reputation of Grand Air, especially with other hungry challengers around, taking their own bites out of the gains of Grand Air. The airline began withdrawing from international services in 1998, and the Philippine Air Transport Office grounded the airline due to issues with safety, adding further woes to the airline. which reported a loss of 21.5 million pesos during its last full year of operation in 1998. The airline's creditors were already on notice, and Grand Air began returning some of its aircraft, including the Airbus A300s. Meanwhile, a 737 in Taiwan was grounded due to issues with the creditors in the country, thus reducing the total number of aircraft in Grand Air's fleet to just 2 aircraft. While licking its wounds, the other airlines were taking a part of the aviation market in the Philippines, leaving Grand Air with just a 5% market share. Eventually, services would be folded in January of 1999 after a nearly 4-year presence in the Philippine aviation scene. When it first started, Grand Air was not only the first mover but also one of the biggest threats to Philippine Airlines, and its failure was a warning to other airlines to be wary of any large expansion plans. Though it's also fair to say that the airline also had bad luck in terms of timing, with the international launches coinciding with the Asian financial crisis. It's been more than 2 decades since Grand Air took to the skies and offered Filipinos more of a choice in terms of air travel, and definitely some of the older Filipino viewers may have memories of the airline. I definitely love to hear these stories, so feel free to leave them in the comment section below. In the meantime, thank you for watching and have a great day.